Adelante, Patricia, cuando gustes.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Successful Caretaker Systems, How to Build Them. This was organized by the Inter-American Development Bank, and this is a conversation that will take place in Spanish. This webinar is part of a series on aging and dependency, series that began in 2020. And in this series, we share experiences, lessons learned on the design, implementation, and evaluation on dependence and care systems. I am Patricia Jara. I'm part of the IDB social and health area. Care today is at the core of social policy agendas. The development of the care sector is part of our 2025 vision, reinvesting in the Americas. And this is the roadmap that the IDB has designed to work together with the countries in our region to take advantage of any opportunities we have for recovery, reinvestment, and long-term recovery from an inclusive perspective. And aligned with this vision, the economics of care systems can generate millions and can also help us ensure gender equality. We have the privilege today of having Julio Bango with us. And based on the experience of Latin America and the Caribbean, he will tell us what elements we need to take into account if we want to build a comprehensive system defining target populations, how we can put together our policy components and others. And he will also give us a potential intersectoral governance system for these kinds of care systems. He studied sociology in Uruguay. He is a professor and a researcher, and he is a consultant for various international organizations, and he has professional experience in the design, management, and evaluation of social policies. He has brought together organizations in civil society, and he has been fulfilling very important responsibilities in the government of the city of Montevideo and the Ministry of Social Development of Uruguay. And he was a national representative, and also later, he was National Secretary for the Comprehensive Care System of Uruguay between 2015 and 2020. If you'd like to know more about his professional background, you can look at the Aging and Attention to Dependency website of the IDB. And there we also have a repository of the knowledge products that we have been producing throughout this learning journey together. Just a note on logistics, we'll have a 40-minute presentation, and after that, we'll have a Q&A session, and we invite all of you to ask your questions in English or Spanish using the Q&A button within Zoom. Please be aware that your cameras and microphones are deactivated. Please visit our website, and if you have not done so, we invite you to visit our website. Go ahead, please, Julio. Good morning, everyone, wherever you are. First of all, I'd like to express how happy I am to be able to spend this time with you. And I'd like to thank our friends at the IDB for giving me this chance to talk to you today. I hope it will be very useful for those who are listening to us and Also, if there are any thoughts that you have, I'm sure they will be very useful to us as well in the work we do over here. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if I can do that. Can you see it there? Yes. Let's begin then. As Patricia was saying, I wanted to first tell you a little bit about the reality, the situation in our region regarding care systems. And I'll mention some issues regarding implementation, because I've always thought it's important to be able to reflect and think about what we're doing with our care policies, but we also need to intervene sometimes and try to make our ideas a reality. So my experience is based on both academic in a way, but also I have been managing these systems in the public sphere. And I'd also like to tell you that all these points that are making are in a document that we produced for ECLAC and for other organizations. And it has the same title as this presentation. You can find it on ECLAC's website. And you might find a deeper analysis there, since we don't have too much time to go into detail today. So the first thought comes from a more of a macro perspective in terms of care systems in our region. And we need to think about care as a pillar of well-being and also of a recovery from our COVID times. Patricia was mentioning some elements that we need to take into account regarding care in Latin America and the Caribbean, and some of the challenges that have already come up and some of the challenges that will come up. And what are some of those elements besides the ones that Patricia was talking about? Demographic transitions that are taking place. Some countries like Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Cuba have already gone through this transition, and this means there's a change in the population pyramid, in the age structure, with the over 65 portion of the population becoming larger. And this should not be a problem for us, because it can never be a problem to see that people are living longer lives, but that structural change does involve a challenge for public policies, for our oversight of them, and for funding of care systems. So in Latin America, we've made some progress in recognizing unpaid work, care work. It's not necessarily the same type of work. There are many kinds of unpaid work, and you see that the time devoted to domestic work or to care tasks is the main barrier to participating in the labor market, as we see here on the right. It has a double dimension to it. Care is a right that people have or should have when they need to be cared for throughout their lives. They should have access to quality care, but care is also a task that somebody does in a society, and it is key for that society. What we have today is a social organization of that care aspect, where the social function of care is a burden on the shoulder of women in their families, and they do this work as unpaid work in the family. And it's clear that families will always have a responsibility to take care of their members. But what we seek to do with public policy is to lighten that burden, especially for women who usually take on these responsibilities, so that we have greater gender equity and women have the same opportunities as males in terms of being part of the labor market, in politics, in society, etc. If you look at how people use their times, then we see that through surveys, how women and men use their time. What stands out is that on average, and before COVID, women were spending 3 times as much time providing unpaid care work as men. And in terms of how to build this type of system in a society, we need to look at the possibility that women would want to enter the labor market. And this means that we need to commoditize domestic work so that women can go out and work outside the home if they choose to. And there are people who don't have the ability to do that. They're in a vicious cycle. They are not able to go out and work. They're not receiving an income, and the families fall into poverty. So we have a reality where we have 13 million people in the region who are working in paid domestic work, and the huge majority, as you can see, of these are women, very often Afro-descendant, indigenous, or migrant women. There's a whole reflection on the whole chain, a global chain of care work, but I don't have time to go into that. There's informality in this as well, precarization, and all this together with all the processes I have mentioned already, demographic transitions, etc., mean that our current social organization for care based on women being responsible or being privatized and within the families is not sustainable, not even in the medium term, but even in the short term, because this creates a deficit of opportunities and inequality of opportunities for women. And it also generates, as we'll see later, negative economic impacts, even in terms of the possibility of growth for an economy. So let's see if I can go on to the next slide. There it is. So why is it necessary to move forward with a care system? So to transform this social organization, we need to build a new well-being pillar, that of care. And our well-being systems were built on 3 pillars: education, health, and social security. And in some way, because the state, the government understood that it needed to guarantee a right to education, health, and social security through public policies. If the government never saw the need to build public policies for care, it's because that function was considered to be naturally, and this was what it was like in our culture, naturally productive roles were assigned to men, care roles were assigned to women. In macro terms, if we go for these systems, it means that we will be generating the conditions for a 4th pillar of social protection. Some people say, for example, and we could reflect here and think that the building of a care system seems to be something perhaps far-fetched, far away, like the cherry on the cake, because we have so many challenges in terms of overcoming poverty in a context of budgetary restrictions. So investing in care, when we have all these other challenges, I think, however, this assessment is incorrect, because in a region such as ours, where according to ECLAC, 65% of homes in a situation of poverty are ones with only one parent, the woman in charge of the household and in charge of children. There's no way to reduce inequality or overcome poverty if we don't see care as another vector, another factor, together with others, to help us solve through comprehensive policies all those challenges that we have in front of us in terms of overcoming poverty and inequality. So in some way, and this means that inclusion is key, inclusion within care systems and childhood policies, because in those homes, that's where the fate of those children is determined. If they're mothers in those one-parent households, if the mothers don't have an income, they will not be able to overcome poverty. And there's an imperative as well in terms of their rights. We look at policy as an amplification of rights. We need to ensure the right of our children to grow, to have adequate childhood development that will help them be successful in life and become productive citizens in society. But also the implementation of care systems should be based on this idea. We want to recover from the pandemic, and this can be an engine for recovery as these care tasks are quick to generate employment, direct employment, especially employment for women, since care will continue to be a feminized area, just like education for many years until we break out of some gender stereotypes, which are culturally determined and difficult to break out of. So these policies can be a part of our economic recovery as we leave the pandemic crisis behind. So this here is what we call our economic returns for this type of investment. Decision makers and economic authorities have that vision often. What are the costs of an investment in policies of this kind, but we also need to think about economic returns that we can look for in the present and in the future. In human capital, that is a huge return when we invest in early childhood. I'm sure you're all aware of that. The creation of direct employment through investment in care and the return that this generates in terms of taxes, thanks to the fact that we are making our economy more dynamic and we are making these jobs formal, part of the formal economy. And this also will reduce the opportunity costs of women if they want to go out into the labor market. And there's a return as well in terms of increased income in the family. Here are some examples. I won't describe them because of time constraints, but these are examples for Uruguay and Mexico with a specific investment, what returns we could see in early childhood or in terms of employment generation or women's employment and tax revenue. And as we look at this, I want to tell you that for the Office on Women, UN Office of Women in Mexico, we did an exercise. We calculated the cost of the implementation of care services in the region. And as I said, we used Mexico as an example for this exercise. And we also projected the return on investment for this investment in care for those people who needed. So returns in terms of direct employment generation and in terms of direct tax revenue, but also indirect tax revenue through the infrastructure construction, for example, for these centers for young children, for older adults, and returns as well because of, or indirect returns, again, because of increased tax revenue. And this publication will come out in the next few days, I believe. So that'll help you see some more detail on how we are supporting these ideas. So what are the elements that are a part of a comprehensive care system? Here, if you could look at the right side of the screen, There's a lot of heterogeneity in Latin America, as in everything in this field. So there's a distinction between policies, programs, and systems. And going back to the example of childhood, a care program for early childhood is just a program, but a policy should include the coordination of various different programs that affect all aspects of childhood development. So care, but also rearing practice, child rearing practices, educational practices, helping the families of those children, incorporating physical and mental health in these policies as well. Now, if we have a system, and now we look at the left side of the screen for a definition, a care system, to build it, you need to coordinate a set of policies targeting the idea of supporting and protecting people who need it, children, senior citizens, and people with disabilities or in a situation of dependency. So it's a set of policies for each one of those target populations. And also, we do a cross section and look at 5 components that need to be present in these systems. And we'll look at what those are now. And so the building of a system designed in this way with the goal of advancing in the organization of that care system, which is deficient today from our perspective, of course, should take place within a governance model that includes interinstitutional cooperation at various levels, because it's impossible to be successful in facing this challenge if we don't bring all the actors together to solve this problem, our deficit in care, if we don't have coordinated action by all the institutions, in this case by the government institutions that are involved. And this goes far beyond the possibilities of a sectorial ministry or for a social development ministry or women's ministry. From our perspective, it requires the coordination of all those institutions that are in any way involved with the aspect of care. So we need to think about a new model, a new way to manage public policy. And to show it here, and this is how I've explained it to Uruguay, we have to transcend from a logic of services to thinking about people. So we need to look at the sectorial objectives of each institution. So we start with the diagnosis, the definition of the problem, a deficit in care for older adults, for children, etc. And based on that, collectively design a plan to solve the problem, and then assign based on the competencies of each institution what aspects each one will be implementing. So that is a different model. And it also harnesses installed capacity that we already have. So we're not starting from zero when we think about creating these care systems. We could have a baseline defined for all the objectives in our countries and the assets. And the assets are programs, regulations, licensing systems, care services for children, for seniors, people in a situation of dependency. We need to have this common vision so we have synergies and more efficient, effective policies that can generate better impacts. So the elements that we need to bear in mind for these systems are these, in fact, a governance model that coordinates the political decisions, what we are trying to promote in the countries that we are working with is to generate a governance mechanism that is interinstitutional under the coordination of one of the entities that are a part of that governance mechanism. Intersectoral management of the elements of it, and we'll look at that, and also a social involvement for management. There are assets in the government, but there are also huge assets for this in the population, in civil society, in the private sector. They have a role to play as far as the care system. It shouldn't just be government integrate what the state can provide, of course, but also what society itself can contribute. I already talked about target populations. From our perspective, they must be a part of this system if we want to transform that social organization of care. And these are the target populations for a care system. And here's some of the principles that I think are very important, because principles condition what type of public policy we're going to implement. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. First of all, the main idea of care as a right for all persons who require or who at some point might need this type of care. It should be a universal right. And this brings us to that principle of universality. Sometimes because we have restrictions in our country, we have limitations, they all do. If we want to have focused policies because we don't think we can afford anymore. And I think that's an error. What we're talking about here is to make progress regarding people's rights, in this case, the right to care. And no country is in any condition to provide universal coverage for services for senior citizens in the short term, of course. But if we have that perspective of universality, then we can gradually increase coverage and we can define our priorities, situation of vulnerability according to age or according to any other criteria that countries decide, but always on the basis of moving toward the respect of this universal right and protecting this universal right. I don't have time to go into all of these, but I'll talk about co-responsibility, and it has two dimensions to it: social and gender. Why is this important? I'll talk about social co-responsibility. We think that care systems should be an act of co-responsibility between the state, the market, civil society, and families, all jointly responsible. If I think that a care system should only be based on responsibility of government and families, then when I design it, I'll think about state services and policies to improve the quality of the service provided in a family. But if I say that it is an act of joint responsibility that also includes the market, then I also need to take into account those services. I can think about the implementation or management of public, private, mixed services. I need to think about regulation, standards for the quality of those private and public services, and therefore the horizon of this policy is. So these aren't just theoretical definitions, they actually make a difference in terms of what type of policy we're going to work with later on. And we could say the same about other principles that we have here regarding financing, for example, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. And here are the components. I was saying that a system is a coordinated set of policies and programs for children, for senior citizens, etc., but not just regarding the building of services. That's what we always what always comes to mind at first, but it also, of course, it includes development and broadening care services in the countries, but also having regulatory policies that can ensure the quality of those services, and that will also regulate labor conditions for the care workers so that it's formal and decent work. And also it requires a component of information so that we have quality services. We need to train the people who will be providing this paid service.
Okay, and then we have the management of information and knowledge. Right now I'm in Lima supporting the government of the country. And for example, And well, my colleagues from the IDB know this very well, that we are working on everything that has to do with trends. For example, we do not have a measure of the prevalence of the dependency in the country. So at the time of defining the universe of the policy, we have a serious problem. So there is a lot of knowledge that needs to be generated. There is knowledge that has been generated, but there's knowledge that has to be generated in order to apply informed, efficient, and effective public policies. And of course, the adequate management of information and a design that should be cross-cutting in the life cycle of individuals is mandatory in order to have policies that are effective and efficient. And then a care system with all the communication policies for the promotion of cultural change regarding gender equality, gender co-responsibility in care. We will always be responsible of taking care of families, but when we have to develop policies that will take care of them, and when we have to take care of them, because this is also a responsibility that we have to do it using shared time between men and women. It is a very slow process, but if we don't begin it, that process of change will never come. And well, in these last few minutes that I have, I'd like to talk about the dynamic of implementation of the comprehensive care systems and the elements for a roadmap. And the fact is that each country has its own culture, its own institutional legacies, its own assets, its own accumulations. They're all differential. So if we shared this horizon of what it implies to develop a care system, we have to establish or develop a roadmap. Each country should do this, which and it will surely correspond to each country and will not apply to all others. So each country has conditions to build their own roadmap. And there, to implement the comprehensive systems, we have to at least think about 3 dimensions of management. The first one that I mentioned before, political governance of the system. And there we have to work on this idea of interinstitutional coordination, going from the services, logic of individuals. And I'll show you what we did in Uruguay. And this is done within a specific schedule. And there are some that cannot enter because they're waiting lists, etc. So we carried out an experience with companies, with unions, with groups of workers where the company would provide the infrastructure, the union would manage the service, and we would finance the operation of the service and define the parameters, the quality parameters, and the supervision of the process, the care for girls and boys. And what we discussed, for example, with a group of workers from a supermarket with a large service, they worked Saturdays, Sundays, they had several shifts. The idea was to open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And there was a capacity for 60 boys and girls, but throughout the week, there were around 90 boys and girls because they would come in, they would leave, and the schedules that adjusted to the children's requirements, but also to the requirements of their parents. And that is a matter of designing tailor suits, as we call them, tailored to the size of their needs. The intersectoral management of the system obviously has to do with generating devices that will allow that all the components of the system, all the institutions that make up the system can do comprehensive, effective, and efficient management. And the participation associated to the management of all the components by all the stakeholders that make up the system, the private sector, social sectors. This is decisive because many times when we plan centrally and we disregard the specificities of the territory, the most probable thing is that that policy will not work right because the specificities of the situation have not been taken into account, the constellation of issues that may occur. So community participation is key so that these services can adequately comply with their responsibilities. And here, I don't know how much time I have left. According to me, I still have 10 minutes. 3 more minutes. 3? Okay, so that we can have some time for questions and answers. Okay, thank you, Patricia. Okay, in this scheme, looking to the left of your screen, the dimension of the populations in the system, the center of the devices that are proposed, and then the management. Populations have already spoken about what we try to do, which is a diagnosis of the deficit in care in a country or at a local level, and generate an interinstitutional device, and then replicate that at a local level with a consultative entity where we have all the organizations of society integrated and that have to do with the solution of care in the field of general planning, policies, the allocation of resources, intersectoral aspects. They have to go through the 5 components, across the 5 components that we've mentioned, defining policies, goals towards each one of the components that have been mentioned there. And in the community, social community participation, we promote the creation of local care plans that specify correctly and that focus on the true issue or that prioritize the problems that may exist in a specific territory. And finally, as a conclusion, the grants to design and implement care systems. I skipped financing, and regarding this, I want to mention something. It is not sustainable to finance a care system only with national budget. And I think that we have to discuss financing and care system in a broader sense with the policies of social security and education in a continent where, for example, the percentage in terms of the income tax on physical individuals in regards to 3.8 of the countries from the other side, we have to think, as ECLAC recommends, that it would not be sustainable to finance the well-being if there is no contribution by society to that end. And in terms of financing, I think that we need to integrate a mix between private insurance, state participation, and contributions by society to finance the system. And finally, as a conclusion, there's a matter of law and economic, one also that has to do with the creation of jobs and the mobilization of local economies through care services, but also an aspect of sustainability for development. Let's say that it is 2040. In 2040, our society will have a population, a very large population of elderly citizens and a reduced active population. So we're going to, that population that is economically active will have to meet 2 conditions. First, to have high levels of productivity that will generate the wealth that is needed to also generate well-being. And this is achieved 2 ways. All the people that work, for them to be able to do so. And we know that there's a large gap in male and female labor rates because many women do not enter the labor market because they have to care for their homes, for their families. So the productive capacity of half of the society many times is lost because the problem of care has not been solved. And on the other hand, the workers, since in 2040, they are the boys and girls that are growing up today. So if we manage to care for them, provide adequate development, have a successful educational and life cycle, and to raise them as citizens that are capable of demanding their rights and that are also qualified and that can have the productivity levels that society will require for well-being. So we can talk about development. That is why this care system, betting on this care system is placing our bets on the present, but it's also essential for social sustainability in the future at a short and medium term. I hope that I've been clear in this short period of time. And once again, I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Julio. I think that you have proposed things that not only put the grounds in black and white and that justify the urgency of advancing faster in this care system, but also showing us the different aspects in this challenge of development of public policy. I will take 30 seconds to say that you've left us with 3 questions that I think will be the questions that permanently accompany us in this challenge in our countries. Why these care systems? Why construction or building, and why care? When you said why care systems, we could start by talking about services, programs, care actions, and of course, the institutional dimension is central to the development of a care culture, which in the end is the greatest transformational purpose that this adventure that we have started has. Therefore, it means to progressively and gradually begin, as you very well said, this process of structural change every time this social function requires support and conditions that correct these inequalities in the unequal distribution of care. But you made us think about what it means to propose a new form of care organization. So in other words, to be prepared for who is going to be responsible for caring for who and adequately. You talked about care as a fundamental pillar of well-being, and that's why we've been insisting on the fact that the task is to make of this a permanent component of social protection by coherently and soundly addressing different dimensions through that system. And that's why what you mentioned as to why building, why developing, and we like this concept of roadmap. Julio said, how could we do this successfully? How could we face this challenge of this permanent response through this policy of social protection with a key focus on care? This means that we have to prepare the institutional sector, because in the structuring of the system, we have to understand this as an incremental process. But as you also mentioned, it is institutionalized and not a matter of junction, with strong emphasis on the benefits component with tangible benefits for individuals. You said going from systems centered on services to systems centered or focused around individuals. And finally, when you said, okay, what care? As a central component of this roadmap, you said to think and rethink about target populations, devices, management. We've learned of mistakes that have been repeated in time through history. And sometimes we look at the target populations, and Julio said, we have to start from the situation of the individuals to develop the services. And therefore, the task is clear: the understanding of the dynamic and practical needs in care. And this means to be aware of the gap, the deficit of care, to measure it, understand it, conceptualize it, measure it, and respond. In this progressiveness is what definitely it means to put people in the middle, in the center of this construction. Well, we have many questions in 15 minutes left. Leonardo from Ecuador asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of combining different target populations? For example, boys or children and elder citizens in a situation of dependency in one same care system. Julio. I'm sorry, the gentleman's microphone is off. Julio, we cannot hear you. Okay, my apologies. Okay, the answer is that if we want to face the challenge, the idea is to start to modify that social organization of care that is deficient. We cannot have an action that is unilateral towards one specific population, but we have to involve the whole set or group of individuals that require care, that to us are those groups, because the need for care, it goes through the life cycle of all of us from when we are born to when we leave this world. And on the other hand, it also requires not only the services, but also the other four components. Our countries have programs and in some cases, care policies. I don't want to mention any right now. In the text that I mentioned, there's a view of the experiences at a national and subnational level. And this is a matter of a new vision with a new logic of management, new rationale that implies the definition of objectives, definition by components, and to define the roadmap for the increase of coverage of the populations. So that's why many times, beyond a problem of resources, it always exists, because one thing is to improve the efficiency and the quality of the expenditure, but without investment, we cannot advance. But there's still a lot to do also from what we already have. This holistic approach allows us to have the object to focus on the solution of the greater problem, which is to guarantee care rights of individuals, generate quality conditions for those that care for these individuals. That will have a repercussion on the services and advance towards this reorganization, this social reorganization. Okay, I will echo one of your phrases. Without investment, we cannot advance. Domingo Hernandez asks, in a Latin American context of low tax collections and excessive inequality, how can we finance these care systems? What types of taxes could be more convenient? And of course, what role can local governments play, or subnational governments, I imagine, in regards to financing and the sustainability of systems? What do you think? Okay, very briefly. We're finishing a document on financing, a financing proposal in the care system for the region that we will soon have in a few months. It will see the light. And I said, it's not possible, but not care systems, because the question by our friend, he could be talking about educational policies or health policies that have the same problem. So with the structure of Latin America, it's not possible to finance well-being. The countries that have achieved adequate development, countries of the OECD, they invest, they collect 4 more times of resources in what we're doing in Latin America on average. So if we want to finance well-being and reduce inequalities, the sectors that have benefited have been able to benefit through the creation of wealth, and they have to contribute to that. And in terms of what we are thinking, we're thinking about creating a fund, social equality funds with contributions from taxes, social and inclusive economy funds. And then on the other hand, also with contributions by the government from general revenues, general income, but also where we can also integrate these contributions by everyone, because somehow if we do not need care now, our children may require this in the future, or we may also require them in the future. So if I contribute and to ensure the care of my children or of my grandparents or even my own, I would be willing to make a contribution. So that is what this is about. We also have to think about financing, and with this I'll finish on care, the restructuring of social security systems. They should also include contributions in the financing schemes for social security and financing of care, because it's just a pension is not enough anymore. People require growing, an increase in cares. And there are also positive aspects of contributing to care. In the United States, there is evidence of a reduction in health expenditures. In Spain, the law of dependency allowed a reduction of 14% of expenditures by organizations, and also the expenditures in the health sector went down. Care in initial infancy makes it possible to generate, with a smaller investment, an improvement in the quality of education of elementary and middle school. So we have to look at this not only as a payment for services, but also how we associate this into an equation, a dynamic of well-being that generates positive benefits for all others. Perfect. All these things that Julio is mentioning, of course, financing, but also articulation for the integration of different institutional responses for the articulation of what we understood as systems, finally lead us to institutional matters related to governance, management. And there are several questions regarding this. Ms. Manorisato asks, what should the institutional architecture be to achieve a governance that will allow the interinstitutional processes and intergovernment processes to occur? She mentions that typically the governments propose the creation of new ministries when they see complex situations, and mentions childcare. But in definitive, from your experience, in leading an institutional process that required to think about a governance program, what can we say about the institutional architecture? Okay, that bet that we made was precisely the opposite of what could be indicated to generate a ministry, to create a ministry of care. We asked, okay, what are the assets that we have in the state? And we traced a baseline. And we saw that many ministries were complying with things that had to do with the resolution of care. So we said, okay, let's draw that baseline, services, regulations, education policies, knowledge, etc. And let's summon, let's think about a design that articulates that and that enhances it. And the key was that money will not leave. The reasoning is to invest. And let's think together, and then we can distribute, we can allocate the work depending on the competency of each sector. That was our rationale. But there's a very important element, which is the political decision. There has to be a political decision and will to go in that direction. And we were fortunate that the President of the Republic said we have to go in this direction, and that is how it has happened and is happening in other countries. If there is no political support to change the rationale of management, that decision by ministers that have to do with the implementation of care, it will not be viable. And the other thing is to demonstrate that this is a win-win model, that a Ministry of Labor benefits if the program, together with the Ministry of Health and of Education, is not only going to obtain a better result in terms of solving of problems, but it will also report positive aspects for the own challenges that for which accountability has to be presented to the President of the Republic in regards to the work. So if we manage to not only do it because of an ethical mandate or a political decision, but it rather becomes a model that grants benefits also to the sectoral aspects, that is where the possibility of actually changing the orientation of management starts to occur. But in the end, it is a political decision for which there should be leadership that goes in that direction. And we are convinced that that is the right direction. Finally, I think that there's a convergence. Is this possible in our region, and how? There are several questions on this in the chat that try to identify what the paradigm is, or what the reference that we should look to is to learn. And as you've said in several of your previous interventions, the fact that the region is heterogeneous is a fact, and that we start from different fields to face similar challenges, but with responses that can and should be very local as well. And in spite of this, the question is, who should we look at? There are keys for advances and good practices that we should take into consideration. Romina Morisato asks, is there a country in Latin America that has been able to have a system, a care system, from which we can also learn on phases to think about how we can move from a program to a system? And maybe it's not just the national experiences, but some good practices that the different countries can contribute with through an experience repository to have these experiences, these learned experiences, but cases of uses, good practices, any references that you can share. Well, I apologize for my vanity or eventual vanity. The system that is operating or has been operating for 7 years now in Uruguay, I think that with its achievements and also with its mistakes, that should be corrected. Because no human being is exempt from mistakes. I think that there are things that can be seen there on how we not only managed to put together a budget, an intersectoral one, and a 5-year plan, which was our great achievement based on that political will, and that later allowed us to develop the system. We made mistakes, but that is where the experience lies, to be analyzed, evaluated, criticized, and used. And there are also other experiences. As Patricia said, at a subnational level, we have a district system for care in Bogota. It is a very interesting bet, a very good one that is in development. It's been in development for a year now. And then there are efforts that are being carried out in Mexico. There's a law that is being discussed in the Senate in Panama, Dominican Republic right now. It is in process of starting pilot plans, pilot programs to scale teaching and scale towards the development of a national care system. And they're also analyzing the relevance of having a care plan and law. And basically, the right of individuals to care is essential. And its nucleus has to be the definition of the institutional structure, the roles, the competencies of the different institutions, so that beyond a change of government, we can think of policies that go beyond the management of or beyond an administration. Then there are subsystems that have been implemented that are of great importance, as is the case of Chile, in matters of childhood policies, or Costa Rica. We're going to see what happens with the new administration, but now a system has been developed for care, or a subsystem for the elderly in a condition of dependency. And in Uruguay, there's a process with an interinstitutional group towards the development of a care system. Argentina, that on May 3rd has taken to the Senate the Argentinian government system for care, which is at a federal level that has other connotations. It is a federal system that supposes the articulation at different government levels with clarity. So there are many things that we can learn from, but I will stop there because we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Julio. It's been a pleasure to have you today. And we also thank each and every one of our participants. We invite you once again to access the content of this theme in the chat that we're leaving so that you could look at all its content. And I close this thanking all of the people that make these seminars possible. The team of the Panorama of Aging, we have Javiera Benedetti, Nariela Arango, Nadine Benerin, Beatrice Fabiani, among others. We also thank everyone from the technical team, Yarumi Atika, Sandra Iriarte, Angelica Mendez, Orsa Saturnil, and Hugo Ramalo, aside from the interpreters. So thank you very much.